Have you ever felt stuck, like God was kind of nudging you towards a change, but you weren't sure if it was the right time? Be that tension between what we want and trusting in God's timing.
Oh, absolutely. It's a struggle many of us can relate to, even outside of explicitly religious contexts. That feeling of knowing you should make a move, but hesitation keeps you rooted in place.
It's a universal feeling, isn't it? And it's exactly what we're diving into today. On the Make Heaven Credit podcast, we're turning to Genesis chapter 31, where Jacob finds himself wrestling with this dilemma.
It's a chapter full of family drama, divine intervention, and ultimately a pretty powerful lesson in discerning God's guidance.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Genesis 31 opens with a shift in the atmosphere. We see Laban's sons, who've been pretty chill up until this point, start to get jealous of Jacob's success. They're grumbling, saying he's taking what rightfully belongs to them.
Right, and what's fascinating here is how even Laban's attitude starts to change. This really highlights the fleeting nature of human favor, doesn't it? One minute you're the golden child, the next your public enemy number one.
And it's this turn of events that sets the stage for God to step in. Verse 3 is where it gets really interesting. God speaks directly to Jacob, telling him to return to the land of his fathers and his kindred.
This is huge for Jacob. Think about it. He's been away for 20 years, building a life, a family. It can't have been an easy decision to just up and leave everything. But God makes it clear, I will be with you.
And that promise echoes back to the covenant God made with Jacob earlier. In Genesis 28:15, God had said he would not leave Jacob until he had done what he promised. So right from the start of chapter 31, we see this theme of God's faithfulness woven in.
And not just faithfulness, but also this idea of divine timing. It wasn't Jacob's ambition or cleverness that got him to this point. It was God working behind the scenes, preparing the way.
In verses 4-7, Jacob gathers Rachel and Leah and explains why they need to leave. He reminds them how their father Laban had been deceitful, changing his wages 10 times. Yet despite Laban's actions, God had protected Jacob and blessed him.
Here's where it gets even deeper. Jacob isn't just complaining. He's acknowledging God's sovereignty even in the face of unfair treatment. This resonates with the idea in Romans 8:28 that all things work together for good to them that love God.
Wait, hold on. For those listening who might not be super familiar with that verse, can you break that down a bit? Romans 8:28, what's the significance there?
So Romans 8:28 is a cornerstone for many Christians. It's this idea that God is in control, even when life seems chaotic or unfair. Not that God causes bad things, but he can take those situations and ultimately use them for our good to shape us and draw us closer to him.
Okay, so back to Jacob. He's seen God work in his life even when things were tough. Then in verses 8-13, he describes this vivid dream. God appears again, reaffirms the covenant. And this is something super interesting. I am the God of Bethel.
That mention of Bethel is key. It's a direct callback to Jacob's first encounter with God, the place where he received that initial promise of blessing. It's like God is saying, remember where we started? Remember my faithfulness then. It's still true now.
It's almost as if God is prompting Jacob and us to remember those moments in our own lives where we experienced his faithfulness so clearly. Those touchstones of faith that we can hold on to when things get rough.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that God doesn't forget us, even if we stray or feel lost.
And how about this? Both Rachel and Leah agree to leave with Jacob, despite their rivalry.
Right. In verses 14-16, we see this unexpected unity between them. It shows they recognize God's hand on Jacob, his blessing. They're willing to leave their familiar life behind to follow where he leads.
So Jacob has God's prompting his wife's support. You'd think it'd be smooth sailing from here. But things take a bit of a turn in verses 17-21. They decide to leave secretly without telling Laban. And Rachel does something pretty shocking. She steals her father's household gods.
Now, Rachel's actions here are complicated. There are a few interpretations of why she does this. Some scholars suggest she wanted to secure inheritance rights, as these idols symbolized family leadership in their culture.
So like a power play.
Exactly. Others believe she was clinging to superstition, maybe not fully trusting God's provision. Regardless of her motivation, it raises this big question about idolatry, something that crops up time and again in the Bible.
It's interesting, right? Because here's Jacob, clearly following God's guidance, yet his wife is involved in something that directly contradicts that. It shows how even within a family following God, there can be different levels of understanding and faith.
And I think that makes it all the more relatable, doesn't it? We all have our own journeys, our own struggles. It's not this picture-perfect, everyone on the same page kind of faith.
So Laban finds out they've left. And in verses 22-25, he sets off in hot pursuit of Jacob. But God intervenes, warning Laban in a dream not to harm Jacob.
This divine intervention really highlights God's protection over his people, even when they make mistakes. It reminds me of Psalm 34.7, which says, "The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them."
It's reassuring to know that God is watching out for us, even when we mess up, or those around us do things we don't quite understand.
Absolutely. His commitment to Jacob doesn't waver. Even though Jacob is traveling with stolen idols, it's grace in action.
Okay, so Laban catches up to Jacob. And in verses 26-30, we see this tense confrontation. Laban accuses Jacob of stealing both his daughters and his idols.
And it's fascinating how much emphasis Laban puts on the idols, right? It reveals his priorities. He's more concerned with these physical objects than with his own daughters. This speaks volumes about misplaced values, about how easily we can prioritize things over people.
That's such a good point. It makes you think about what we might be clinging to. Those idols in our own lives that we prioritize over relationships or our faith. It could be anything, possessions, status, even good things like work or hobbies that become all-consuming.
Exactly. The human heart is wired for worship. The question is, what are we choosing to worship?
Okay, so things get even more tangled in verses 31-35. Rachel, who has hidden the idols, lies to her father when he searches her tent. Talk about awkward family dynamics.
While Rachel's actions are undeniably deceitful, they also point to the consequences of clinging to those idols. It foreshadows the struggles with idolatry that Israel will face later on. It's like this small act has these larger ripples throughout history.
It also makes you wonder about God's timing, doesn't it? Because even though Rachel lied, she doesn't face immediate punishment.
Right. God's justice doesn't always play out in our human timelines. It's a reminder that he sees the bigger picture. And it's also a reminder that we're all on a journey. Even the people in the Bible, they weren't perfect. And neither are we. It really is remarkable how much is packed into these verses. It's not just an ancient story. It's a reflection of human nature that's still relevant today.
Totally. And we're just getting started. Picking up with verses 36-42, we see Jacob, understandably frustrated, confront Laban directly. This isn't the same Jacob who arrived at Laban's doorstep all those years ago.
Exactly. This confrontation reveals a new side to him. He's no longer the timid nephew, easily manipulated. He's finding his voice, recognizing the injustices he's faced, and standing up for himself.
He passionately reminds Laban of his 20 years of faithful service, pointing out how he bore the responsibility for any losses, whether caused by wild animals or even theft. He really lays it all out there.
And I think it's important to note the contrast here. Laban is focused on material possessions, the idols, the potential loss of wealth. But Jacob is focused on the principle of fairness, the value of his hard work and integrity.
It's like he's finally realizing his own worth, not just as a worker, but as a man who has been walking with God.
Yes. And this leads him to that powerful declaration in verse 42. "Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me. Surely thou hadst sent me away, now empty. God hath seen mine affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight."
Whoa, chills. That's a serious statement. What's the weight behind those words?
This is Jacob publicly acknowledging that his success and protection came not from Laban's goodwill or his own cleverness, but from the God of his ancestors. It's a powerful testimony of faith, especially considering the tense situation he's in.
He's basically saying, Laban, you could have taken everything from me, but God wouldn't let you. He's been with me every step of the way.
Precisely. It's a reminder to all of us that even when we feel overlooked, mistreated, or taken advantage of, God sees our struggles. He sees our efforts, and he fights for us.
Okay, so after this intense back and forth, verses 43-50 shift the focus to a sort of reconciliation. Laban realizes he can't undo what's been done and proposes a covenant between them.
And this is where that heap of stones comes in, right? They build this physical monument as a symbol of their agreement. It's something we see a lot in ancient cultures. A visual reminder of the promises made.
So it's more than just shaking hands and saying, no hard feelings.
Way more. It's a public declaration, a binding agreement made before witnesses. And the place where they make this covenant is called Mizpah, which literally means watchtower. This isn't just a coincidence.
I was just about to ask about that. The name has this weight to it, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Laban says, "The Lord watch between me and thee." When we are absent one from another, it's not a warm, fuzzy farewell. It's a solemn recognition that God is a witness to this agreement and will hold them accountable.
So Mizpah becomes this place where God's presence is invoked to ensure justice and fairness, even when they're apart. It's like saying, we may not trust each other, but we both answer to a higher power.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful concept even today. Our relationships, our agreements, our actions, they're all lived out before God. He sees everything and holds us accountable for how we treat each other.
This is blowing my mind. It's like every detail, even the name of a place, has deeper significance in the Bible.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the richness and depth of Scripture. There's always more to uncover, more to learn.
So with this covenant in place, verses 51-55 describe the final farewell between Jacob and Laban. They kiss their children and grandchildren, offer sacrifices, and finally part ways.
This parting marks a huge turning point for Jacob. He's leaving behind the negativity, the manipulation, and stepping into a new chapter. There's uncertainty, of course, but also this sense of God's continued blessing.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Laban deceived and mistreated Jacob for years, yet there's a tinge of sadness in their farewell.
It highlights the complexities of human relationships, even those that are deeply flawed. Amidst conflict and hurt, there can still be a sense of shared history, a connection that's hard to sever completely.
It's like a reminder that forgiveness and reconciliation, even if not fully realized, are always possibilities. God can bring healing and restoration even to the most broken situations.
I completely agree, and it's something we need to be mindful of in our own lives. Holding on to bitterness and resentment only hurts us in the long run.
Wow, we've covered a lot in this section. Confrontation, covenant, and farewell. What stands out to you as the most impactful part?
For me, it's Jacob's transformation. He goes from being a victim of circumstance to someone who recognizes his worth, stands up for what's right, and ultimately chooses to move forward in faith, trusting God's guidance. It's an inspiring arc, even amidst all the drama.
It really is a story that resonates across time, isn't it? We may not be shepherds dealing with tricky relatives, but we all face those moments of uncertainty, those choices where we have to decide if we're going to trust God's leading or cling to what feels familiar.
Exactly. And Genesis 31 gives us this framework for understanding how God works in our lives.
Yeah.
It's not always a straight path. There are twists and turns, but his presence is constant.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to touch on some of the bigger themes that stood out to me. First, it seems like this chapter is a huge testament to God's faithfulness to his promises.
Oh, absolutely. From the very beginning, God made a covenant with Jacob, promising to be with him and bless him. And throughout this chapter, we see those promises being actively fulfilled. God protects Jacob from harm, provides for his needs, guides his steps, even when Jacob makes some questionable choices.
It's like, even when Jacob messes up, leaving secretly, letting Rachel take the idols, God doesn't just throw up his hands and say, forget it.
Right, and that's where we see God's grace and mercy really shining through. It's a reminder that even when we stumble, God is still working for our good, drawing us closer to him. His love doesn't have an off switch.
That's so encouraging. Another theme that keeps popping up is the danger of idolatry. Rachel's actions with the household gods really expose how sneaky those false idols can be.
It's a warning for all of us to be vigilant, to examine our hearts and see if there's anything we're putting above God. It might not be physical statues, but it could be anything. Material possessions, success, approval from others. Even good things like our careers or hobbies can become idols if they take God's place in our lives.
It's so easy to get caught up in those things, to let them define our worth or happiness. But this story reminds us that true fulfillment comes from a right relationship with God.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And speaking of protection, we can't overlook how God intervenes to keep Jacob safe. Laban couldn't touch him because God was literally putting up a barrier, both through dreams and this unseen hedge of protection.
It makes me think about all those times in my own life where I've narrowly avoided disaster, or things have worked out in ways I couldn't have planned. It's a reminder that God is always watching over us, even when we don't realize it.
Absolutely. And sometimes that protection means leading us out of situations that are harmful. That's where the theme of separation comes in. Jacob had to leave Laban's sphere of influence in order to step fully into God's promises for his life.
That's a tough one, but it makes sense. Sometimes, in order to grow closer to God and fulfill his purpose for us, we have to make hard choices. We might need to create healthy boundaries, let go of toxic relationships, or step away from things that are holding us back spiritually.
It's not always easy, but it's essential. We're called to be set apart, to live differently from the patterns of the world. That doesn't mean isolating ourselves, but it does mean being intentional about what we allow into our hearts and minds.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Genesis 31, what's the biggest takeaway you want listeners to walk away with?
I think it boils down to this. Even when life feels messy, God is faithful. He guides us. He protects us. And he ultimately leads us towards his promises. Even if the path isn't always clear, it's a call to trust in his timing, to examine our hearts for those hidden idols, and to be willing to make those tough choices in order to follow his leading.
So well said. This has been an incredible journey through Genesis 31, and I hope everyone listening feels equipped to dig deeper into God's word and see how it applies to their own lives.
Me too. It's not just an ancient story. It's a living, breathing guidebook for navigating the complexities of life and faith.
And hey, if you want to see this chapter come to life visually, head over to the Make Heaven Crowded YouTube channel. We've got the whole thing animated, and it's amazing.
Don't forget to leave a comment and tell us what stood out to you. We love hearing from our listeners.
And if this episode resonated with you, please share with someone else who might need to hear this message of hope and encouragement. Thanks for joining us on the Make Heaven Crowded podcast. Until next time, keep seeking God and making heaven crowded.